Thank you guys so much for, you guys are really far away
Yeah,
all of a
we
sudden.
are.
We can move in.
Furniture rearrangement.
I'm
Thank
sorry,
you.
Charles. I can't do that.
Can you open the doors, though, for me? Okay, so it's 4:30 in the afternoon. It's been an amazing day. I have heard personally from Elon Musk that the entire planet is going to end because of artificial intelligence, possibly tomorrow. Is that accurate? Should we be terrified? Should everyone in this room be terrified that AI is going to kill us in the next 48 hours or sometime thereafter?
Well, it's March 6th, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Everybody go hide.
That's a hard question to open with. I don't personally think so, but I do think there are a lot of challenges facing the space that need to be addressed.
I like that you started, I don't personally think so, but, okay, so make the case then, everyone in this room I think likes technology. We love the idea behind AI. We grew up being promised a bright future where robots can make decisions for us. But it seems like a lot of this conversation is around the fact that AI is dangerous. They like to interrupt us by auto-launching motorcycles. AI is dangerous. AI is racist. AI is biased. Why should we not be terrified by the possibility of AI rather than optimistic? Terah?
I think there is a reason to be afraid of the future that we're building if we're not intentional about its development. I think you mentioned racist AI as one example. There are tremendous bias and inclusion issues in the field right now. And I think that unless we work to start solving those issues today, we will be facing a future that none of us really want to live in, frankly. That's a very different type of danger from the sort of existential, the world is ending tomorrow type of perspective, I think. And one that, I think it's important to mention positions people at the center of that problem set as humans who are making decisions every day about technology, right? Tech is not anything more than a series of decisions that we have the opportunity to make. And I think it's really important that we remember that. I mean, even large tech companies are institutions that are led by people, right? And we have a set of choices in front of us, and some of them are really tough. And I think unless we confront those, then there is a danger that we're creating a future that...
Do you think, and Sean, this is for you also, because both of you work in AI. Terah, in particular, you're working with a group that's essentially trying to set the ground rules for what ethical AI should look like, or at least a conversation around that, because there is this concern. You work on issues like autonomous weapons, right? The capacity for weapon systems to kind of choose on their own, possibly, or at least encourage us to who should live and who should die. Is the tech community the right community to be policing itself around AI? Or should we have a conversation that actually says the tech community shouldn't have a seat at this table because we're worried that they're biased?
Well, I think it's a little unrealistic to say that they shouldn't have any say, right? But most anything that we do is going to have multiple stakeholders, right? And so a lot of the conversations that we're having now are not just about, oh my God, can we invent a lightsaber? But what color is that lightsaber? I mean, I like what Nancy was saying earlier, right? That any of these technologies, depending on who is holding them and what they do with them, can have a very different positive or negative valence.
And one of the choices, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to agree with Sean. I mean, you use the word multi-stakeholder. That is the principle that undergirds the Partnership on AI, which is the organization that I work for. And we actually aren't really working on lethal autonomous weapon systems. That's part of an issue set that we might be confronting in the future, but we're still wrapping our hands around what exactly we want to prioritize. And the key to all that is a multi-stakeholder community that lies at the heart of the partnership. That's hence the name partnership, right? So we've got 54 members, and they far exceed just the technology community. I mean, these are members of civil society and advocacy groups, academic institutions.
Groups like the ACLU that have brought cases against AI decision making.
So the core of our mission really is inciting those hard conversations, and not just within the technology community, but within the constituency that tech directly impacts.
So let me actually ask this of folks in the room. a number of people in this room work with communities that are underrepresented or that are otherwise don't have a voice at the table. How many of you feel like you've worked with a community or you're aware of a community that you feel like have not benefited from AI decision making, either because the systems? Oh, this is a good number of hands, and this can engender some distrust, right? What's the solution for people in this room, for people outside of this room, when we say, look, AI systems seem to bias towards stereotypes, which we know are true? How do we fight against that without saying this technology should be cast aside?
I think first it's asking that question. And realistically, a lot of the research community didn't know to ask that question before.
That's interesting.
And this is true in the history of technology, right? So at Mozilla, we care about the internet as a public good, right? This open, accessible for all people public good. And the same thing should be true for AI. We just have to ask the right questions about it. And so one of the approaches that we have is around the training data, the things that make up a lot of that, having that be open in the same way that we have a strong belief that when we make code and open source projects open by design, they have impacts that bring in those questions, that let people ask those questions.
Right. And is that about diversity of who is in the room making that product? Is it a diversity in who is providing the data? Where does the diversity come that gives us exposure to those other viewpoints?
So I think it comes at all parts of the stack. Here's a good example, right? So we do a lot of work in speech and speech machine learning. And part of that comes from this fairly early on realization that speech recognition was only working for certain populations. Turned out that was because the thing that you used to actually kind of train and empower AI was being focused on certain populations that spoke English, Californian accents. It didn't include everybody. And so one approach to that is then to say, okay, well, what if we can actually open that up and have more people contribute to that? So people from countries all around the world, people with different accents, and use that to create the data set, right? The training data that teaches an AI what and how they understand things. And I was told to avoid technical things, but I'm curious, how many, when I say training data, because I know that data has been said many times here today, how many people here know what training data is? Okay, it looks like maybe half. Can I just explain one quick thing?
Yeah.
So AI is just statistics, right? It's just a machine. The thing that has changed over the last few years that's really interesting is that we used to actually code up everything. We'd write some source about how a decision was being made. And in the last few years, we've actually changed that, and we use what's called training data. And that means I show a picture of a cat, and I train it as the word cat. I show a picture of a dog, and I show the word dog. And the place where that bias comes in, if you're using, say, speech, is if I only teach you to recognize speech with a bunch of voice samples from a bunch of white men from California, you will only be able to recognize a bunch of white men from California. And that's when I say training data, it is the diversity of how we create that training data, the biases and how it's represented. All of that are aspects that we haven't really historically looked at.
Yeah, I think the Common Voices initiative that Mozilla is running is really groundbreaking with that regard. It approaches that full stack of solutions orientation that Sean described. I mean, it has to be diverse teams working on products so that they think about diverse constituencies in the platforms that they're building and the impacts that they might have, whether outsized or otherwise, on the populations that tech is approaching. It also needs to be diversity in the data sets, as was mentioned, because that deeply impacts the outputs that these platforms provide. And bias is a huge problem. And even spanning, Alexa, for example, not being able to recognize certain voice tones is one thing, but when you apply algorithmic decision-making to other areas that have deep impacts on life outcomes for certain demographics, for example, in the criminal justice realm or in healthcare or education, then you're really talking about decision points that really need to include diversity by design.
So what responsibility do communities have to start providing that data to try and overcome the bias? Because it's interesting. I would actually suggest to everyone in this room that those of you who didn't raise your hands to say that AI has been biased against you or someone you work with, that you're wrong. it actually has, and you just don't know about it, right? You didn't know that your insurance is $5 more per month. You don't know that you were denied something that you should have otherwise gotten, or some deal that would have been mailed to your neighbor. When communities start saying, look, we need to be part of the solution, how do they do that? What responsibility do they have? But more importantly, how do they plug in? How does a community say, we have a particular accent, we want our voice data to be part of the training set?
And something that the partnership is thinking really hard about right now is how we empower the voices of civil society and advocacy organizations equal to the technology companies that helped found the work that we do. So, capacity building in populations and in organizations that represent them that have been traditionally marginalized from these types of conversations is something that I think is quite central to our mission and necessary for the success of a multi-stakeholder initiative like ours that has the intention, as we do, of creating best practices for responsible technology design and AI. And sometimes that means empowering those organizations and voices with capital. Sometimes it means educating them so that they have the tools to bring arguments with real thrust to the table in conversations with technologists and engineers at companies or otherwise. And it might take a variety of other different forms, but I think really starting the conversation in a place that recognizes that there's a need to support that type of work is a really critical intervention point.
Sean, you're at the forefront of actually trying to go out and get that data to educate your systems. Do you find that some communities are better than others in terms of understanding what you need or being proactive partners?
I mean, we certainly see differences. But a lot of times it's a positive surprise in that difference, right? So we have a small team who is working on the project, and suddenly there were representatives from other countries who were impatient for us to set up the API so they could build it for their own languages. Now, I think we have around 14 languages that are supported, not from our efforts, but because the community stepped up and said, you know what, we want to have our voices included in this. Earlier, DeRay was talking about the fact that everybody has a voice, but not everybody's listening. And I think part of it is actually engaging with these different projects so that, yes, everybody has a voice, and that they can actually take action themselves to do some of that. That's one of the powers of the open source projects. I think it is also worth framing it when you were asking about what people can do, that there's an opportunity here. And so it's not just about voice, but around the data that helps train these AIs or the data that you're just using for analysis, that if you think about your data as an opportunity, that it's actually a way for others to start being creative about it as well. So I love Nancy Lublin's example in Crisis Text Line, right? I love the fact that they put their data out there through the challenges, through the complications of what it means to anonymize very sensitive data, right? To discover new things and to let other organizations help and discover things for themselves as well.
Well, and let me ask something on that, and we're going to go to questions, but before we do so feel free to think them up. But I want to ask this one thing, which is the other side of this, right? Which is 2 years ago, if we were having this conversation, I would have said, I will happily give the government all of my data. Since then, some things have happened that make me a little bit more concerned about the surveillance state, and perhaps I should have been concerned before 2 years ago. I think there are communities that say, look, I don't want to be part of this system because the more data I hand over, the easier it is to surveil me. Even if it's not my data that they're looking at, even if it's anonymized, I know that the smarter I make those systems, the more they're going to be able to pick out me and watch me. Why shouldn't communities be concerned about that and shy away at perhaps their own expense from part of this project?
Well, I think it's a valid concern, frankly. I don't know if there's really a binary answer either way to orient one towards. I think that that is a central challenge to AI that might separate it, one could argue, from part of the rest of the open source movement. I think there are certain parts of it that we definitely should, and I think that the examples we've given here today are really good ones in that category. But it inherently is what we refer to as a dual-use technology in many respects, which means it can be used for good or for bad purposes in different application areas. And I think it's worth us keeping that in mind. And to proceed with caution, I think a lot of this too stems back to public education. The more empowered consumers are to make decisions about the data that they provide, technology companies or other platforms, I think the better off that we all are, because policymakers can respond to a system that's better informed and a more nuanced public debate. Companies can hold themselves to a higher standard with regard to the way that they protect and disseminate and utilize data. And just generally speaking, we elevate the entire conversation.
Questions? Who has questions about AI or the social impacts of AI? Everyone's cool with the overlords coming in. We'll submit to the robots right away, no problem. While you're thinking, let me ask one other thing. And Terah, I'm putting you on the spot here. We should mention that your organization only started 3 months ago. So
well, I was hired 3 months ago.
You were hired 3 months ago.
But I'm the first executive director.
You're the first executive director. So it's maybe unfair to ask you to answer all of the AI questions for all of time. But what's interesting is that what we've been talking a lot about making AI more inclusive, making data sets more inclusive, about trying to expand the tent around this technology. But then there's another part of this technology, which is groups like yours in the past in other fields have oftentimes said, there's a bright line in the sand that we won't step over. These are kinds of behaviors that we could engage in that we haven't. And interestingly, on the AI front, one of the big leaders on this has been the gambling industry, right? There was for those of you who don't know, a number of gambling companies, particularly Harrah's, which is now known as Caesars, used a lot of advanced machine learning to figure out who to target among their customers, and they found that their algorithms very quickly would bias towards a certain number of minority populations, particularly Asian populations and Jewish populations, to receive a disproportionate amount of advertising literature. Their data sets, for whatever reason, were pushing them that way. And the gambling industry, and particularly that company, said, we will make a promise to actively fight against any kind of ethnic coding in the algorithms that we're building. Even though that made the AI in some cases less optimal for the questions they were trying to answer. What are the right lines in the sand? As activists in this room are thinking about what they want to write to their legislators on and to company leaders on and say, this is the bright line, the things that shouldn't be touched. When it comes to AI, what are those bright lines? Where do we say, angels don't tread here?
Yeah, I mean, that is the million-dollar question, I think. And the reason for the partnerships work is that the answer does not come with these 6 tech companies that founded us, which I should mention include Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, IBM, and Facebook, sitting alone in a room together, thinking through the answers. This is really, where those lines should be drawn is really a collective enterprise. And that is the reason for the multi-stakeholder focus that we have, because there are constituencies implicated by technology that need to be a part of the conversation about what the limits and bounds should be. But it's certainly not beyond the scope of our mission to help figure that out. We have already published a set of tenets, which include 8 rules that we hold. They're essentially community guidelines, and they're fairly broad, but they include things like, AI should not be used in scenarios that inflict human rights violations, and so on and so forth. And one could say that there needs to be several layers built into those community guidelines that actually allow them to be operationalized in a technology setting, which we agree with, but we're working to figure out the mechanics of that all right now.
Sean, as you guys have grappled with this, have you come up with bright lines?
I think part of it is having more engagement. I mean, the thing that we know we can't do as an organization is understand all of the needs of the stakeholders, all the different ways things are being used. And so, the most important aspect for us has been engagement from people and having positive actors in the space, right? I mean, it is a technology, it's a statistical method. Writing is a technology as well, right? And if you have positive actors in the space, you get positive writing. I think there are some interesting ways in which we can look at history and technology to also start to think about those So Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility was an organization that kind of came out of the early AI movements, Terry Winograd and some of those folks, and they were asking some of these same questions initially around things like, should computer scientists be working on guidance systems for missiles, right? And I think we can look at some of those and actually at least glean some of the high-level social aspects about those lines. But realistically, it's changing so fast, it's going to be more about engagement and the individual cases than it is about general lines.
So let me ask the flip side of that question. For folks in this room who work at nonprofits, who work at for-profits that are doing social good or social activism, what aspects, what tools of AI and of machine learning and of availability of data are people not taking advantage of? If you had the magic wand of sort of educating everyone with this is what this technology can do for your life and you don't even realize it yet, what is that?
I have one quick thing, which is just, it is an aspect of literacy and understanding what it is. So it turns out that it's useful to understand what averages mean and what means and medians mean, and that we can learn a lot from those, but also understand that as much as we learn from those, there are lots of different framings on the statistics from them. And so I think one of the most important things you can glean from it is that it's not truth, right? That it is a particular view and in some cases a decision-making process or a way to unearth something. But it's not an absolute truth, and knowing that means that you can actually take more advantage and benefit for an individual or an organization in using it.
What about running campaigns? Because I assume many people in this room work on campaigns or they run fundraising campaigns. I mean, I covered the last presidential election, and one thing that I actually that I walked away with is the Trump administration was more sophisticated about targeted advertising online than the Clinton administration was. They spent more money on it. They did a better job of it. They had a more sophisticated attitude to it, in part because they were much more open source. They relied much more on being agile. Has understanding of how to take advantage of the agile methodologies around machine learning and sort of the philosophy that comes from it, has that penetrated enough into organizations like the ones in this room? Or is there something to be learned there still?
Well, I'm not sure what organizations are in this room, to be honest. So I don't.
Or as you survey the landscape.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Do you say to yourself, look, there's this magic power here that people aren't taking advantage of?
Yeah. I mean, I think this speaks to the point that Sean just made, which is about technological literacy more broadly. It is well worthwhile social impact organizations thinking about the ways that they might apply some of these methodologies and technologies. What I hesitate to preach is the gospel of like the machine learning magic wand, right? Because I don't actually think that it should be applied in all circumstances. And I also think that it's worthwhile being skeptical and using that skepticism to your advantage as you start to deploy technology. I think that can be a true superpower, actually. And I know that as you mentioned, there have been some organizations that have spoken here today who are doing that to great effect, which is great. I think that interrogating these things is really, really important.
And the great observation is even when there isn't a result, a decision, a thing, asking, well, what does that really mean? Because you always need a narrative to go with the quantitative result. And if that narrative doesn't make sense, or there's probably something else going on there. I mean,
right.
When you see statistics about, there was a recent article about the LA Times application for some open data in policing, right? And there was a question they had. There was something that didn't seem quite right in the narrative. And so they asked that question, they dug in a little deeper, and sure, there was a statistical thing that was happening about arrests, but it turned out that there was a much deeper story than the claim that was originally being made.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think the danger of applying technology without being intentional about it is that you don't combine social reality with technological solutions, right? And the dangerous circumstance that ends you up in is in kind of thinking about technology platforms as a sort of panaceic solution or band-aid, without actually really thinking about the secondary or tertiary implications of applying it in certain circumstances.
I think it's a great, and I'll mention, and this might be a nice place to end, when I've covered AI, it seems like the communities that try and wrest that narrative away from technology companies, from the people from the powerful, are the ones who succeed. The gambling example that I mentioned, what was really interesting was that the pushback on that was communities, most particularly Chinese American communities, saying, you are finding a correlation that we do not believe exists. You're finding a correlation because you're looking at biased data sets. And yet, as a result, you are flooding our communities with mailers and with promotionals designed around gambling. And you're creating a narrative in this world about a problem that a community has that we don't think we disproportionately have. And by wresting that narrative away, they forced the gambling industry to re-look at their data and to change the narrative that was guiding decision making. So it's incredibly powerful. Well, thank you both. If the robots come to try and kill all of us, I will send them your way first. Thanks, guys.
Sounds good.